So one thing to keep in mind as we look at Paul's letter to the Romans is that Paul spent a good bit of time arguing with people, not wrangling, but going through the arguments for why they should believe that Jesus is the Messiah, both in synagogues and in the public squares throughout Greek and Roman cities. So he heard a lot of counter arguments and criticisms and people attempting to critique the weaknesses in his case. So it's inevitable that as he writes about the gospel, that he throws in some of the kinds of arguments he heard counter to the things he was declaring. So that's what we're going to see here at the beginning of chapter 3. Also, the other thing to keep in mind is that in bringing a case against humanity, both Gentile and Jew, that we are not just sinners but guilty sinners, it's also inevitable that people will eventually criticize God himself. It's one thing to sort of defend ourselves and come up with all sorts of reasons we might have why we think we're absolved from guilt and we shouldn't face the wrath of God. But also, at some point, we're going to probably end up criticizing God himself, because it's a personal disbelief. It's a personal rejection of God in the end. So that's what we're going to see here at the beginning of chapter 3. The question that's raised right at the beginning is, what advantage has the Jew? And Paul immediately says, well, they have a huge advantage in many, many ways. And he just begins by pointing out one thing, perhaps the biggest thing, which is that they were entrusted with the oracles of God. Now that word oracles is the word loia in Greek, and I'll explain why I wrote that in just a second. But God spoke personally and directly to that nation. God didn't speak to Socrates or the Athenians. God didn't speak to the Romans or the Babylonians or the Egyptians. He spoke directly and personally to Abram, to Isaac, to Jacob, to Moses, and so on. So that was a huge benefit and advantage that Israel had, the average Jew, that God had spoken directly to their nation and had made promises to that nation. But that then raises this question about faithfulness. Does the fact that some were unbelievers or unfaithful, does their faithlessness, does their unbelief or lack of belief nullify the faithfulness of God? So the question here is about God's own faithfulness. Is it the case that because some people were unfaithful, some Jews didn't believe, does that in some way negate the advantages they had through these promises? And the answer is no, of course not. Let everyone be thought of as a liar before God be thought of anything as other than true. And at that point, Paul quotes from this psalm. And what psalm was it? It's Psalm 51, which is a very famous psalm because it's the poem that David wrote on the occasion. As it says in the introduction to the psalm, it's the occasion when he sinned with Bathsheba, and Nathan the prophet came as sent by God to expose his guilt, to expose his sin, to expose his hypocrisy. Because remember, Nathan told a story about a Jew in David's kingdom that had done something very hypocritically, and David wanted to bring the judgment of God upon the head of this person in this what turned out to be essentially a parable that Nathan told. And then Nathan said to him famously, "You are the man. You are that man." So David's own words were being now used against himself. And David proved to be the hypocrite then, which is precisely, if you recall, what was spoken of back here just a little bit before, where it says, you who say, you who say one must not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? And of course, David committed adultery. And there was this little line here, which could be from one of the prophets that seems to be similar to Isaiah, the most similar to Isaiah, but it's also an expression that is used by Nathan to David in 2 Samuel, chapter 12, where he exposed him. It says, the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. So David, anyway, is this sort of becomes a kind of prototype of the Jew who is a guilty sinner who acts hypocritically, saying others should be judged when in fact he's guilty of the very thing they should be judged, that he's calling down judgment upon them for. But in his psalm of repentance, in Psalm 51, David makes this comment that his infidelity did not negate God's justification. That is to say, God is declared righteous. God is shown to be just and faithful in his own words. And that word there, words, is the word logos. It's very similar to this word here, which was used here, the oracles, in verse 2 in the original language. So that is to say that God's own words, God's own promises, he's still faithful to them, to the nation of Israel, even if Israel itself and some Israelites are unbelievers or unfaithful. Then that leads to this second question, which is meant to be a ridiculous question. And we know it's ridiculous. It's the kind of thing someone would have said as a kind of shot against Paul, but it really does not hold much logic, because we know it's a ridiculous question because notice he says right here, I speak in a human way. So the question he raises right here is meant to be sort of the way a human, a sinful man might argue, but it's not really a very good argument, counter-argument, but it's one Paul heard, which is that if our unrighteousness in some way shows that God is righteous, if we somehow by our wickedness, our guilt, our sin, enhance or put or highlight the divine glory, the divine righteousness, does that in some way mean that God is himself wrong? He is unrighteous. Notice now the question isn't whether he's unfaithful, as it was up here, but whether God is unrighteous in his character to inflict wrath on us by being angry with us. Is he somehow wrong? Because, I mean, after all, our unrighteousness has shown all the more his righteousness. And, of course, this is just a ridiculous argument. If, in fact, if God was unrighteous to judge some Jews who were guilty sinners, or all the nation, if he was unrighteous to do that, how could he judge the whole world? There would be no ultimate judgment and no ultimate hope for the world. And then he extends this just a little farther into ridiculousness. If through my lie God's truth abounds, why am I still being condemned as a sinner? And of course, this isn't Paul's argument. This is what he would have heard from other people. Why shouldn't we just do evil then? Why not just go out every day? I mean, in other words, some people were saying to Paul, based on what you're saying, Paul, it basically doesn't, if we just sin, we just make God seem all the better. So we should just go out every day seeking to do evil just so that there'll be some greater good that comes from it. And Paul says people slanderously charge them with this or accuse them of teaching this kind of nonsense. All right, so that's an attempt, anyway, to attack the character of God as a way of deflecting his wrath from us, that whole section there, 3:1-8. Now, the final paragraph on this long diagnosis of human guilt is verses 9-20, all the way down to here. And what you'll see, first of all, is that there's this sort of litany of quotations from the Old Testament, just an array of a sort of shotgun blast of various verses from the Old Testament. Why? What are all these verses? What's the point of all these verses? Wouldn't just 3 of them be sufficient? Why are there so many? And what do they focus on, and what do they have to do with this particular part of sort of closing out his argument? And who do they relate to specifically? Who are they describing? And then the final question that you have is here in verse 19 and 20, because in this part, Paul makes a really interesting point that raises a pretty big question. He says that if Israel was guilty under the law, that in the end makes the whole world guilty. And that just seems kind of odd. Like, why would my guilt, why is it the case that if I were guilty for something God said to me that I was disobedient of, why would that make everybody around me guilty? How would that work? So that's two questions anyway for this final section here on diagnosing human guilt. So best wishes, and we'll see you next time.